So today we're talking about negativity bias. You may have heard this term in the logical fallacies. Let's look at some descriptions. First, let's have a meme for an example. Do you know how draining it is that my brain is programmed to think the worst case scenario of every situation just so I'm mentally prepared when stuff goes wrong? Very relatable, but yes, this can be considered negativity bias. The wording in this meme makes it sound like the person is entirely beholden to the whims of their own neurochemistry. So let's examine how this can be viewed as a limiting belief. Now, yes, our brains did evolve as predictive processing systems to predict the worst possible outcomes so that we can defend ourselves, so that we can be prepared. But fortunately, that does not have to rule our lives. We do have conscious ability to regulate that and to eliminate it entirely as well with various practices. Although, of course, you don't want to completely eliminate it. You want some form of defense. You just want it to be a comfortable sense of self-defense. So the word programmed here implies permanence. And this is a rather deterministic, reductionist way of thinking, which is leaked from our universities into the public vernacular, it seems. It's affecting our conceptions of self and ability. Now, it's partially true. There are parts of our brain that can predispose us towards rumination, but we've had remedies for this for thousands of years. In the overly analytic and isolated West, however, we tend to pathologize these experiences. And when we go to spread memes like this in social media land, this can just reinforce that as a bias, as a negativity bias. Also, when we say every situation, that commits the absolutism bias. It's very, very common. This is the most common logical fallacy, it seems. So overall, this can be thought of as catastrophizing, cognitive distortions, limiting beliefs, overthinking. Pick your term, negativity bias is here at its core. Alright, let's take a minute to look at some other ways to think of this. So behavioral psychology will show you that it's far easier to remember the most negative, dangerous, and salient experiences because these keep the organism safe. This is true for most organisms on the planet. But for Homo sapien, it's a little bit different. It's also much easier to recall information that is in opposition to other people's theories than one's own, especially when this involves previously held beliefs or when it concerns comparison. For example, you could be listening to a podcast and the speaker misspeaks in a way that you normally wouldn't, and that happens to be the only fact that you take away from the entire interview. And that's very unfortunate, but the ego keeps us safe in this way. This is the ego at work, and there are parts of that that are very difficult to suppress. It's unfortunate, especially if you grow up in the West, it seems, because superiority plays heavily into our social interactions and social awareness, and our sense of inclusion and purpose and belonging in the tribe. Another example is, say, an ex-Christian atheist finds it easier to retain knowledge and recall terminology that concerns arguments against Christianity as opposed to arguments for it, or for other religions. Negativity bias can also be seen as a defense mechanism involved in holding a structured narrative, which relieves cognitive dissonance. Having a consistent narrative makes you feel more safe and secure in the world. A narrative is very powerful, and people will go to war over keeping a narrative straight, keeping a story consistent. They'll put their lives on the line to keep that story consistent. So when people lead us to questioning our narratives, this can indeed cause cognitive dissonance. It can create dissonance in the brain, and this is very uncomfortable. It requires metabolic energy to be questioning that. The brain often defaults to the path of least resistance in this way. The brain requires 20% of your body's metabolic energy, and it's only 3 pounds and runs on the electricity of a 10-watt light bulb, so it's constantly making these trade-offs and compromises to keep you safe and sane. Now let's look at this through the lens of the culture wars. Terminology plays a heavy role. If someone's offending you and you have a large swath of language readily available to precisely describe how they're being an insensitive victim blamer or an ableist or bigot by providing unsolicited advice, this might reinforce that pride in yourself and a feeling of correctness. These terms will bubble up to the consciousness more readily than others, leading to a kind of attitude of anti-ableism. Sometimes that's very helpful, and sometimes it's counterproductive. And of course, the exact opposite takes place on the right via the same mechanisms. Someone will see political correctness as an infringement on their rights of free speech, and they'll think in terms of anti-wokeism, or they'll call someone woke, or whatever, which is an extremely dangerous term, because nobody seems to agree what that means. That being said, social media algorithms feed off of these reactionary instincts. This is why comment threads get so heated. Each side only sees the worst in each other naturally, and the algorithms only show you what you'll react to. Don't let this machine drive a wedge between those that you could potentially be relating to. Stay mindful, we're all in this together. But this gets a little bit more complicated with negativity bias. Due to these biases and self-defense mechanisms, we react more strongly to opinions that are put in text or meme form. When we add our comment, it's very easy to forget that there's a human on the other side of those words. And the fact that in most cases people are very misguided when they go to use these systems. A lot of times people get online and they're reacting wholly from an emotional place. If they were talking to you face to face, they'd probably be treating you differently. Let's take an example from the movie The Social Dilemma. That is a very powerful example, and I do worry about the coming generation and how they're going to handle this. This is why I'm making videos like this, so that we can get these messages out there and hopefully prepare people for the world that they're beginning to enter. Negativity bias is most prominent when it comes to those that we disagree with, but we can't physically interact with well. In social media, this is worse because we can't view the little subtleties of body language, inflection, eye contact, and someone's actual intention. We end up filling in the gaps unconsciously and act like keyboard warriors defending ideologies that most people don't actually even care about. We get excited when strangers give us approval points with little emojis, and we end up breaking normal social boundaries when someone disagrees with us because we can't see their actual reactions. Now let's take a look at this through the lens of psychology. So when it comes to negativity bias and narcissism, or narcissistic personality disorder, we want to try to reduce the overactive insular cortex and try and enhance the anterior insular cortex, or the compassion center of the brain. Now, there's plenty of controversy around the following suggestions, but bear with me. The best solution for this is meditation and the abstinence from drugs and alcohol. Drugs only make your brain more erratic and overactive, or they just flatline your ability to feel any salience towards anything, which is what you see with prescription medication. If your body's ingesting too much of a particular substance for it to handle, it can go into a kind of heightened self-defense mode. And the tricky thing about this is that it's hard to tell where that line is. You can get kind of comfortable where you think that you're high functioning using this substance, but it's actually really messing with you in ways that you don't completely understand, that are hard to detect. This is why I recommend meditation first, specifically Kaya Nuprasana body scan meditations, so that you can develop receptivity towards the signals that your body is sending you, as opposed to just ignoring them or becoming overly sensitive to them. There are many therapies in this regard as well, learning to recognize which signals are worth acknowledging, which signals are very important to acknowledge, and which ones are not. So we might find it very easy to tell ourselves that we have narcissism or have narcissistic personality disorder, when what we really have is an overactive insular cortex. This is the disgust response area of the brain, which is very overactive in most people. It activates when you hear ideologies that don't adhere to your current biases or your current ideologies. It can lead to overreaction, it can lead to anger problems, and when you go to use terms like narcissistic personality disorder, it can easily be used as an excuse instead of something to actually work on. That being said, there are other ways to look at negativity bias. It seems to be most prominent when we get into arguments. In these cases, it's as if we're in court and we're just ready to present the judge a list of complaints against the other person. But of course, when it comes to our own faults, that list is usually much shorter. It's harder for us to recognize them, and it also is very embarrassing for us to vocalize them and admit when we make mistakes. It seems as though it's very easy to keep an unconscious list of all the transgressions and indiscretions our families, friends, and romantic partners make. And when it comes time to defend ourselves, it's as though we have that list just ready and waiting to go. But it's actually worse than that. The brain doesn't record information logarithmically. It's much more emotion-based. And this means we unconsciously record far more of these transgressions. And this means we unconsciously record far more of those transgressions than we may actually realize. There are many different types of memory in the brain, and many of those are hard to access, especially when we're running on high emotions and we're in an argument. In these cases, it seems that we're fueled by an unconscious list of negative perspectives like this. And that list can become conscious, though. That's why we must practice empathy and mindfulness at every opportunity. This is the value in meditation, in the cognitive therapies, and in the contemplative practices, where we get to train our brain and recognize our emotions and recognize when we're attaching words to our emotions. Basically, we want to establish more control over how we commit certain events to memory and how we respond when someone challenges us. We mock that which we are afraid to confront. We fear what we don't understand, and our defense mechanisms kick in when we're confronted with ideas that make us question our world model or our sense of identity. But we gotta remember, most people are kinder than we perceive, Negativity bias fuels defensive assumptions about others, but we gotta remember, people are often far more kind and trustworthy than we usually presume. Studies have shown that people who are overweight, or are younger than us, or are of a different race, tend to trigger the insular cortex responses before they actually hit the prefrontal cortex, where we have the experience of realization, which is very unfortunate. And it's very easy for us to put up unconscious mental barriers because we were hurt in the past, and it's hard to trust people. Yet, most of the time, we can trust people to hold the door for us, to return the grocery cart after they're done shopping, to gather together to lift a car off of someone when they're trapped, or to offer directions to us when we're lost. We have to remember how this works with abstraction as well, and the level of complexity that we occupy right now in our species. We have 8 billion people across this planet, and thus, many different ideologies have formed, many different conceptions about how to run these giant societies that are far past the 250-person Dunbar number that we are used to as a species. This is what leads to many of these biases and negativity towards people that we don't truly understand. When it's someone that you can see directly in front of you that's trapped under a car, most times people will gather together to do something physically about that to remedy the situation. But when it's someone in another country that's of a different religion than you, or a different political ideology, it's so easy to get caught up in these paradigms, and that's why we have to be wary, especially online and when you're watching mainstream media. Basically, these psychological defense mechanisms are what has kept our species alive for all these years. But when we hide from them, or try to label them as a diagnostic disorder, or try to mask them with drugs and escapism, we rob ourselves of the opportunity to truly get to know ourselves and to form a sense of agency and self-control. So, I hope this has been very valuable. I hope that I've explained this in a way that's very cordial and effective. If I've said anything weird here, please let me know in the comments, and I appreciate you very much. Hope to see you in the next one.